today on Farm to Home, you guys are going to learn how to propagate succulent plants in two different ways. The first one in a traditional soil method, and the other one in a hydroponic water method. The first way that I'm going to teach you is very traditional. It's just soil and a direct cutting from the plant. So I'm going to take this soil. Typically for succulents, peat soil is the one that works the best. And so I'm just going to pour some of this soil into a flat tray. A baking dish works really good. I got these at our local grocery store at Rayleigh's. And so you can just get them. They're aluminum trays, so you can reuse them or you can throw them away. And I'm just going to flatten this soil out into this tray, but it's nice and shallow because succulents don't grow very, very long roots when it comes to this. And so I'm just going to flatten it out so it's a nice even layer. And this soil has a little bit of moisture in it, but I want to make sure that it has a good start to it. I'm going to give it a little tap so that it kind of flattens out. Again, a baking dish works just as good, but these aluminum trays that you can buy at the grocery store work great too. So the other thing I'm going to use is a squirt bottle. And that squirt bottle is just going to mist my soil because you don't want to overwater succulents. It's really important to not do that. So I gave it a little bit of a mist, and I have some rocks that are actually in my soil. So I'm going to take those out. And we're just going to take a direct leaf cutting from the plants. There's lots of different ways that you can propagate succulents, and so we're just going to do a direct leaf cutting. So I'm going to come over here to this succulent plant, and I want to make sure that I just pop these leaves off right at the stem base. And so when I pop those leaves off at the stem base, I have that intact at the end right there. So I'm going to pull a couple of those off. Lots of different ones here from my mother stock plant that I have. You can buy one of these with lots of different varieties from places like Greenacre, Home Depot, Lowe's, all of those different places. And they're a great way to start a succulent garden. And succulents, they actually break apart pretty easily, and I have lots of different varieties here. So I'm just going to give us some variety in our transplant bed because I want to make sure all of these get transplanted. And so one thing to mention that you want to wait about 3 to 5 days, and you want to just lay these on like a paper towel or somewhere for about 3 to 5 days, because that stalk on the very end, it forms a callus. And it's really important that that piece forms a callus, because if it doesn't, then you don't have the ability for it to fight against disease. And things like bacteria and mold can start to grow. And so that is very good for you to be able to, anywhere from 3 days to a week. You want to make sure that you give it time to callus over. So it kind of makes like a hardened callus just over the edge where you picked it away from the rest of the plant. Once that 3 to 5 days is up, all you need to do is you want to make sure that you just kind of tap it down into the soil, and you want to just lay it nice and flat. You can make a pattern if you want. And this is going to sit here for about 8 weeks. And it takes about 8 weeks until it's ready to transplant into a smaller container like these little containers that you see here. So I'm just going to make sure that I tap those down. You want to make sure that that calloused end is not covered by the soil, but just kind of in the soil and covered just a little bit so that it can grow directly to it. So I'm just going to lay it out like this, and I'm going to again just give it a little mist. You want to do this every day, probably just once a day. And I would recommend doing it in the morning, because if you do it in the morning time, you're going to put this in a windowsill or something that gets a little bit of light, not direct light, because succulents actually can burn. So you want to make sure that you put it in a windowsill or something that's going to get light, and that water, when you mist it in the morning, has the ability to evaporate. So if you misted your succulents at night, it's okay, but depending on where they're at, they could increase the chances of them getting mold. So that is just one way to propagate. And then in about 8 weeks, we're going to come back to this and we will see what they will have. The ends of these where they callus will actually start to form little new plants and roots, and then we'll be able to transplant them into tiny little pots like this. So this is the first way of our traditional leaf cutting propagation. The other way that you can do this with the soil is if I were to just take a direct cutting off the top of one of these plants. So if I were to take a section of this plant and cut it, I could actually take it and put it directly, a whole piece of it, just into the soil. Again, it's always good to let it callus for about 3 to 5 days, but I could just transplant this somewhere in here, or if I wanted this variety of succulent in this little pot, I can transplant it there as well. So that's another way that you can do it. You're just using more of the succulent plant. So they call that traditionally like a beheading of the plant instead of just a leaf transplant. So those are just the two ways that you can soil transplant and propagate succulents. So the new way that I'm going to teach you is hydroponically. You can do this with a large like Pyrex bowl or a dish. I think mason jars work great if you're doing this on a smaller scale. So you need a mason jar, and I'm going to fill this up. This one's a quart size one, and I'm going to fill it right to the neck because you don't really want the water touching the leaves when you put them in. The other thing you're going to need is saran wrap, and so I'm going to put the saran wrap in front of my jar. I'm going to pull the saran wrap over very tightly, and I'm going to hold it down. And so it's really important, and I have found actually it's a little bit easier that if you kind of make it really taut and then pull it down, that it works well. And even if you take the cap on it and put it on, it works a little bit easier. You don't have to, but it tends to keep that saran wrap right in the spot. So you want it to have a little bit of attention to it. Then I'm going to take a knife, and if you're working as a student, make sure that you have a parent adult to help you. But I'm going to make a tiny little hole. And again, I'm going to take these off, any little leaf cutting. So I'm just going to do a leaf cutting. And again, making sure that you wait that 3 to 5 days to let this callus. So I would pick it off the plant, lay it in a dry place on a paper towel, do not water it, and let it callus for about 3 to 5 days. And then you could actually transplant. So I'm just going to grab a couple of these leaves off. And we are going to get started here. So I have some different varieties. I have about 3 different varieties. I've already poked a tiny little hole in here. And so what I'm going to do is just very carefully, I'm going to put that leaf cutting right in the top. Now, I'm not letting it touch the water. So again, I'm going to make another hole. And I put my next leaf cutting right in here. Again, not touching the water. If one starts to fall through, that's okay. You can always fish it out, or you can leave it there. It's not going to really hurt anything. And so I'm just going to poke these guys in here, not touching the water, because you don't want them to mold. If they touch the water, they will have a tendency to mold, and they won't really grow that new plant that you want. All right, and again, just want to make sure that you let that callus for about 3 to 5 days and let that start. All right, and so that's as simple as that. And the same thing, you would want to put it in the sunlight, somewhere in like a windowsill that doesn't always get direct sunlight. And then about every couple days, you just kind of want to swish it around, get a little bit of water on the bottom of them, and then it'll kind of, gravity will take its toll, and it will dry off of there, and so they have the ability to grow. Again, then in the water, you will see little roots starting to grow towards the water, and you will also see little micro succulent plants starting to begin. And about 6 to 8 weeks, depending on the type of succulent, they'll be ready to transplant into a little tiny container just like this. So to give you a little background, if you were to go buy this at Home Depot, these are about $3, and this larger one was about $24. If you propagate from a larger plant, you can save lots of money, and it's a fun project at home to do with your friends and family. You can take a small amount of succulents and turn them into an entire backyard very quickly, because they do actually propagate very quick. So we will see you in a few weeks to see our progress on our succulents.